Good morning. Welcome to episode 35 of the Hockey Variety Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Sunday morning, I had a little bit of time. My fiance is getting off her night shift in about an hour here, so I have the house to myself. And I thought I'd do a podcast. I had a bit of time. I don't know when the next time I'll be able to do another one. It might not be till even after the Cup finals have wrapped up. So, any chance I can get to get on the podcast, I will take it. So here we are, and I'm very much a morning person too. So this is actually like a pretty good time to ramble about hockey for myself. Because lately it's been after work, and I'm usually just pretty gassed by that point. And I think I've been doing it okay on the podcast in terms of energy, but usually by the end of the workday, I'm pretty done. I'm very much a morning person. And I think that's why I like to work out in the morning because that's when I'm on, right when I wake up. So yeah, really, really glad I got to get on the podcast here today. I've got my coffee next to me here. I got the weirdest coffee drinking routine. It's really strange. So this coffee I'm drinking right now, it's 1 part caffeinated, 2 parts decaf. And I know that sounds super weird, but hear me out. So I used to have not pretty good health. I'm epileptic technically, but as of actually last week, I haven't had a seizure in 10 years. So it wasn't really a genetic thing. It was just kind of I just really didn't take good care of myself in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, and it led to the point, yeah, I had a couple seizures. It's scary, really. So then after all that went down, I started to take better care of myself. And one part of it was back in my early 20s, I used to drink a ton of coffee, a lot, I would say. I can't even really, maybe 3 or 4 cups a day, maybe 5. It was a lot. I felt especially in my teenage years, I really treated it like a competition, I can drink so much coffee. And it's kind of a generational thing too. Whenever I visit my parents, my dad drinks a lot of coffee, but probably about that same amount, 3, 4 cups a day, probably closer to 4. But he's come a long way in taking care of himself. So I really don't care too much about his coffee intake, and it doesn't really seem to affect his mood or anything like that. And then his dad, my grandpa, he is just the coffee machine all day. I don't get it. I've seen him drink coffee at 2 in the afternoon, 3 in the afternoon, and then he sleeps fine, and then he's up at 4 or 5. And this guy's in his 80s now, and he drinks so much coffee. And then so it's kind of been decreasing by the generations, I guess. So I guess if I have a son, he'll drink I don't know, 1 little dinky coffee every day, and then because what I do now is I drink 1 big coffee right when I wake up, 12 ounces. So, 1 step ahead of the regular coffee size. And then usually after my workout, once I start work for the day, I'll have the kind of coffee I'm having right now, which is 1 part caffeinated, 2 parts decaf. And, I think that's the perfect balance for me because I like coffee. I like the taste because I'm insane. I drink it black because I'm a man. No, I'm just kidding. It's no calories that way, and I've just kind of gotten used to drinking my coffee black. So, and I feel you get the full taste of the coffee there too. So, I like that side of things. But yeah, I usually have an iced coffee that's 1 part caffeinated, 2 parts decaf. But yeah, no, I mean if you're listening and you think you drink too much coffee, I recommend cutting back. I've tried to cut out coffee altogether, and I'm just way too addicted, I would say. I need to have coffee every day. It's tough, and I like coffee, and I feel 1 a day at least is okay. I guess I have 1 1/3 caffeinated coffee every day, but yeah, if you drink 3 or 4 cups a day, it might be worth cutting back, really. I'm a lot less anxious throughout the day. I use the bathroom a lot in the mornings, but I'm using it even less now that I've cut back my coffee over the past few years here. And you save money too, right? I drink the fancy stuff, but my parents, they buy the Folgers, but they drink so much coffee. I get it, right? But if you're only drinking one cup a day, you can have the fancy stuff, so that's nice. Anyways, yeah, got my coffee. My hockey team's we're doing our jersey vote the next few days. That's exciting. We are getting secondary jerseys right now, or for next season rather. So yeah, we're doing like 2 votes. We're narrowing it down from 10 to 3 different jersey designs in the first vote, and then we're gonna vote on the 3. And pretty much for this first vote, I'm just gonna let them vote for any jersey, really. Like, so they could vote for all 10 ideas. They could vote for one. Like, it's gonna be more of like a kind of survey setup. And then the second vote, yeah, they're only gonna have one option to choose, or they're only 3 options to choose from, but they're only gonna get 1 vote. So I'm pretty excited for that. I think all 10 designs look pretty sweet. One thing that's interesting is our current design, or our current jerseys that we wore all season. Well, for most of the season, the jerseys came in a bit late because there was just a big issue with not who we bought the jerseys from. He's great, but his company, the company he gets his jerseys from, it was just a nightmare, and they messed up some of our jerseys. So, he was really cool to us, but we had to wear our old jerseys for the first like 10 games of the season. And those jerseys our current jerseys are based on like the 2020 LA Kings reverse retro, so purple and gold. And it's neat because we're the Vikings, and that's like the Minnesota Vikings, the football team. Same colors, which was actually totally by accident. And what's neat about that is we got the 2020 reverse retros for the LA Kings right now. And one of the jersey designs that's actually in the vote that we're going to have, it's actually the 2022 designs of the LA Kings reverse retros. So we might end up with 2 LA Kings reverse retros, which are pretty sweet. I mean, like, you can't go wrong. Like, if you're making a hockey team, like a rec hockey team, and you're picking out jerseys, there's nothing wrong with going with a current NHL design, because that design was made by professionals, right? Like, you can't, I mean, I've come up with my own original designs for this vote, but at the end of the day, like, the ones that are based on actual designs already, those are designed by professionals. That's pretty cool, right? So I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but yeah, I'm pretty excited for that. See where that goes. I got I'm trying to think of like what might be some of the front runners. Like, we got the mid 2000s LA Kings design, so no gold in there, but the purple, the black, the silver. The LA Kings had really clean jerseys in the mid 2000s, so we might be going with their whites. We're going with whites no matter what. Actually, we were thinking about going with maybe a black design, but it's like it kind of defeats the purpose a little bit, because getting a second set of jerseys will be nice for those teams we play against that have darker colors like us. Like, there's a team that we play against that has green, and you might not think purple and green clash too much, and overall it's not too bad, but every so often there'll be a play where I see a player in my peripheral vision and I can't really tell in the moment if they're green or purple. So it'll be nice to wear white against those guys. So yeah, we're going for a set of whites this season, and yeah, it should be sweet, and they're gonna look sweet no matter what. So for today's podcast, I'm actually finally going to be taking a look at a little bit of hockey history, and I want to talk about. I really want to take a look at the Chicago Blackhawks during their like 10-year span when they were really contenders. So yeah, and I feel like it's kind of, I talk about Chicago quite a bit on this podcast, and I want to show them a bit of love, really, because what they did in that 10-year span, it was impressive. I think it's good to look back on. And then I'm actually going to talk about some other hockey podcasts, some podcasts I listen to or maybe don't listen to as much anymore. And I'll get into my reasons, of course. But yeah, so I'm going to be talking about a bit of hockey history, a bit of hockey culture. But we had Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals last night, and I got to talk about it, right? How do I not talk about that? So let's start with this. I kind of like starting the episodes. Well, apparently today I like talking about coffee for 5-10 minutes, whatever. But I like starting the episode with the current stuff going on. So yeah, let's get into it. Vegas 5-2 win over the Florida Panthers in Game 1 in Vegas. And it was a pretty good hockey game. I'm not going to lie. I was kind of half paying attention for a lot of it. I don't know. I was tired. I had just a crazy run for my marathon training here. I ran 19 kilometers yesterday, and that was tough. That was tough. Like last week, I ran 18, and I had probably the single best run of my entire life in terms of pace and distance. Yesterday might have been one of the hardest runs of my life. My legs were just killing me 3 kilometers in, but I don't know. I found a way. Once I hit the halfway mark, I kind of found a second wind, and I was feeling okay, and I got the job done. But anyways, uh, so I was pretty tired. I wasn't paying too much attention to this, but it was a pretty good game. It was pretty back and forth, at least for the first two periods there. But yeah, Vegas pulls off the 5-2 win at home. I feel like home ice helped them a lot in this game. You know, I mean, you can see the little, not the game sheet, but you can see a little bit of the box score there on the screen on YouTube here. And you can see the goals were paced, or they were, Vegas's goals, they were split up enough that I feel like it kept the crowd engaged for pretty much the whole game, with the exception of maybe some segments of the first period. Because, I mean, Florida did score first. Eric Stahl, man. Eric Stahl with the shorty. I love Eric Stahl. I would love to see this guy win another Stanley Cup 17 years after his first Stanley Cup, first and only Stanley Cup with Carolina. And I would love to see Stahl. I'd love to see Mark Stahl win a cup too. I'm really rooting for those guys. And then there's of course there's a bunch of guys on Florida that I'd love to see win a cup, and even some guys on Vegas too, you know. But especially those original misfits, I do like that line. Even as a Sharks fan, I do like guys like William Karlsson. It'd be great to see him win a cup. But you know, I think it's two pretty good stories this year. But I feel like Vegas's goals were split up well enough that they kept the crowd into it, and I feel like that played a part, especially when Marchessault tied it. It's a shame that third goal from Vegas, because like Bobrovsky's stats aren't going to look great after this game. Well, I mean, you know, his stats are still going to look great, but this game brought it down. But I really don't think I can blame Bobrovsky for any of those goals. And the third goal especially was the tough one, because that ultimately was the game winner. And I mean, that was the game winner in the moment too, because that broke the 2-2 tie. And it was on an Anthony Duclair self-screen. He screened Bobrovsky, and inadvertently, obviously, nobody does that on purpose. But it just, like, it sucks, because Duclair was having a great game. He scored the goal late in the second to tie it at 2. I felt like Florida had some momentum there, and then that goal from Whitecloud and the Duclair screen. I feel bad for Duclair, because I thought he looked fantastic. And then, you know, he kind of played a part in that goal going in. Bobrovsky definitely didn't see that third goal. And really, yeah, I can't really put Bobrovsky on a lot of these goals. I thought he looked really good. He had this sweet pad stack that the commentator on TNT, he was kind of just like, oh. And then he didn't really say anything about the just super awesome, like, kind of retro style pad stack. That was sweet. But yeah, Aiden Hill with a crazy paddle save, kind of reminiscent of Braden Holtby's paddle save against Vegas, which is kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a neat thing. 2018, you know, I think that was like the defining moment of the 2018 playoffs, as that Braden Holtby save. Holtby was so good in those playoffs, like real underrated member of the Washington Capitals in 2018. I thought. I think he finished with a 920, which is impressive. 920 is a good save percentage. I think we forget that because we see so many like just gaudy numbers this year with Aiden Hill and Sergei Bobrovsky. But yeah, the Golden Knights, they played great. Really, they played a good game. Again, I think the crowd played a big part in it. Start to finish, I think Matthew Tkachuk. Man, I think he kind of played a pretty big role in them not coming back. I think it was 4-2 already by that point, but once Tkachuk got kicked out of the game, you know, I think that really sealed the deal. I was like, I don't know. I mean, I think Sam Reinhart had a pretty good chance after that. That Aiden Hill had a great toe save on. Hill looked great too, I thought. I think once... I didn't think Hill looked great at first, but he looked better throughout the game, I think. And Matthew Tkachuk, man, I think he's going to hopefully be a bit more disciplined after this game. I think the reffing was a little questionable. I don't want to scrutinize him too much, but you could tell the refs are trying to just take one guy out of a scrum. Because when you take one player out of a scrum, what that does is it tells the other bench, it tells both benches that it's like, hey, listen, like if you're gonna do this stuff after the whistle, we're not taking both guys, and thus no team has a power play and doesn't really affect things. Rather, we're gonna take one guy, and someone's gonna be on the power play after this, and you don't know who necessarily. And I feel like they leaned a little bit towards Vegas a bit more with some of those calls out of the scrum. Maybe it's just me. Maybe that's me kind of having a bit of a Florida bias because I'm definitely rooting for Florida. But I feel like in those scrums, Florida got a little bit screwed over a bit. And the last one, like the last one especially, Kachuk might have been the biggest bully in that pile up, but or that scrum rather, but I don't know if it was that, like, because he got a double minor and he got kicked out of the game, and that's like your best player getting kicked out of the game, right? That is a big deal, even with only 4 or 5 minutes left. But yeah, I really try not to be too critical of officiating because I think refs do a way better job than fans will give them credit for ever. These are the best of the best, but you know what? I was a little bit iffy this game with the officiating, some of the decisions made. I don't think Vegas should have came out of that scrum with a 4 minute power play. I really don't. I don't think it was worthy. But maybe I missed something. Again, maybe there's a bias there. But yeah, I kind of think some calls really went the wrong way against Florida, which that's just my opinion. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Maybe I'm a little bit biased here, but yeah, it was a really good game though. If you're not watching the Stanley Cup Finals this year, I highly recommend you do. It was a great game. This should be a really fun series. I think it's gonna be just as fun as last year's Stanley Cup Finals with Colorado and Tampa. That was a good one too. As someone who's not a fan of either team, yeah, really really good game one, and game two Monday night. Can't wait. I'm glad it's Monday, not Tuesday. I got lots of running around to do Tuesday. I'd probably miss some of the game if there was a game that day. So, yeah, glad it's on Monday. Looking forward to that. Should be a good time. All right, let's get into a bit of hockey history here. So, on this podcast, I've gotten into something that I call the cycle of contention. Highly recommend checking out that episode. And I will be revising the cycle of contention in the off season once we've seen where everyone finished in the playoffs here. I know there's only one series left, but also when we see what signings some teams have made early in free agent signing, and then the draft too. So probably sometime in July or August, I will revise the cycle of contention and where I think every team is at in terms of their respected rebuild, or if they're contenders, or if they're questioning, or if they're on the up and up, whatever. And just in relation to that, I want to look at what I'm going to call the contention window for the Chicago Blackhawks. Another thing about this podcast, too, is I'm such a Chicago hater, and I'm going to admit, like, San Jose, my favorite team, they were a pretty good team during the same era Chicago was winning all their championships. So obviously I'm bitter because as a Sharks fan, we've never won a Stanley Cup. And in the span of time where San Jose was a very good team, Chicago was winning all these championships, and same with LA too. So I'm very bitter towards those two teams because of that. That being said, this is the closest thing to a dynasty that we've seen in recent years. And the last dynasty we had in the NHL, and if you don't know what I mean, that's 3 Stanley Cups in 4 years. So that could be 3 and 4, that could be 3 in a row. And the last team to do that was the Oilers in the 80s, who won 5 cups in 7 years. And this is what's referred to as a quote-unquote modern-day dynasty. The Chicago Blackhawks won 3 Stanley Cups in 6 seasons. And the Detroit Red Wings actually did that not too long before the Chicago Blackhawks. They won, I believe, 3 Stanley Cups in 6 years. That was 97, 98, and then 2002. I'm pretty sure that's 6 seasons. Let's see, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, that's 3 cups in 6 years. So both the Blackhawks and the Red Wings did that. But, I mean, the Red Wings Cups is very well documented. They won another one in 2008. That's actually where I'm going to be starting this little narrative. So I want to look at just before Chicago became contenders, and then I want to look just after and where and how things wrapped up. So on the screen there in purple, I have the years where they won their Stanley Cups labeled, and then I have teams kind of color coordinated based on those are any team that has a color is a team that lost to the Chicago Blackhawks, because I really want to look at what fan bases might be just as bitter about the Chicago Blackhawks as I am. And you know what? Like, it honestly felt like the San Jose Sharks lost to the Blackhawks so much in the playoffs. And I didn't even like think about it. It was actually only once in 2010. That was the only time Chicago beat the San Jose Sharks during this span. So maybe it has to do with regular season stuff, but it's just like, I guess it comes down to watching this team dominate while my team disappoints. And then maybe that's why it feels like they beat the Sharks more than they did. They only beat the Sharks once. You know, keep in mind that it was a 4-0 sweep in the conference finals. I was only 18 years old when that happened. I don't know how much of that playoffs I even watched. I do remember, Philly's storyline too, but I'll get to that. So 2007, 2008, that is the last year where Chicago didn't make the playoffs before this run they went on. This 7-8 year run they went on, and they drafted Patrick Kane first overall the previous draft going into that season. So that season was all about developing Kane and Taves and Keith, and they didn't have Hossa just yet. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about kind of the big four of Chicago, that being Kane, Taves, Keith, and then Hossa. Hossa's kind of the forgotten one too. If this is like the big four on Chicago, it's like Hossa's like the Anthrax, you know. Kane is Metallica, Taves is Megadeth. I guess Keith is Slayer, but maybe Keith and Taves are a bit interchangeable. But Hossa is definitely the Anthrax of the big four. Little thrash metal reference for you guys that know what I'm talking about here. But yeah, so they didn't make the playoffs, but it's a step in the right direction. The pieces are there. They bring in a few guys, and then in the 2008-2009 season, they go all the way to the conference finals. It's the first time they made the playoffs in a while. I think it was maybe 6 years up till that point. And they beat Calgary in the first round. Fun fact, I think it was either the last team to eliminate Chicago or their last series win. I can't remember, but it was actually Calgary. So that's kind of interesting that, their last playoff appearance involved Calgary, and then their first one in this new era involved Calgary too. And that's the only time we see Calgary up on the screen here. And then round 2, they go on to beat Vancouver, and then they lost to Detroit in the conference finals, 4-1 in the series, rather. I got the scores up there too of the series, and or the result of the series rather. And then Detroit would go on to win the Stanley Cup against Pittsburgh. And then 2009, 2010, this is Chicago's first Stanley Cup. And they beat Nashville in the first round 4-2. They beat Vancouver in the second round 4-2. You do see Vancouver on the screen a few times here. 3 years in a row, in fact. San Jose in the conference final, swept them. Very heartbreaking for myself. And then they beat Philly in the Stanley Cup finals. Such a weird run out of the East. I'm pretty sure the conference finals was Philly and Montreal. And they were the number 17 and number 18 ranked team in the regular season. Very weird. I don't know if we've ever seen that or if we've seen that since. I know Florida was the 18th ranked team going into this Stanley Cup, but the 17th and 18th ranked teams meeting in the conference finals, very weird. And keep in mind, there were some very good teams in this era too. You had Pittsburgh. I don't know if this was one of the years where Crosby was hurt for a lot of it, but they had Malkin. And then they have, prime Ovechkin with the Washington Capitals. Like, there were some really good teams in the East. And then you have the 17th and 18th ranked teams meeting. Very weird. But it doesn't matter because Philly still lost to Chicago. They had a weird goalie situation going on there too in Philly. They had Brian Boucher, Michael Layton, And I think Ray Emery was hurt. I think Ray Emery was supposed to be the guy going into the playoffs, and he was hurt. I don't think they had Bobrovsky worked into their roster by that point yet. But yeah, it was the Boucher-Layton show, but didn't matter. Antti Niemi and the boys getting the job done. Antti Niemi, longtime Sharks goalie. But before he went to the Sharks, he won a cup with the Chicago Blackhawks. And one thing to note about that Stanley Cup win as well is this is an original six franchise, and their last cup before the 2010 Cup was in 1961, I believe. So we're looking at, 49 years, 49-year cup drought, right? So we talk about the Leafs' current cup drought, and Chicago's wasn't too different from what we're currently seeing with Toronto. That's a pretty long drought. If you want to talk about really weird droughts, look at the New York Rangers. Oh my goodness. So the Rangers' last cup was in 94, which was almost 30 years ago. But prior to that, their last cup was in 1940. So with, let me do the math in my head here. If I'm correct, I think that's an 83-year span, and the Rangers have one cup in 83 years. I think I did the math right there. 83 years. Yeah, it's insane. Some really weird cup droughts we see with some of these teams that have been in the league for a while, including teams that have never won the cup, like we see with Vancouver and Buffalo. But anyways, I'm getting off track here. Big cup win. Chicago wasn't able to hang on to a lot of the guys on their roster. They just couldn't pay them, really. They had to give up Antti Niemi, a goalie that took them to the Stanley Cup there, and he played okay in that 2010 run, but they had to let him go. They had to let Byfuglien go. That's probably the most notable, because Byfuglien was a beast. Everybody knew Byfuglien was going to be a beast. He went to Atlanta, and then ultimately they would move to Winnipeg. And I'm sure I'm leaving some pretty key guys off here, but those are the two I always think back to. But there's other guys. They had to bring new guys in. They brought Hossa in just before that 2010 run, so Hossa would go on to win 3 cups with the Chicago Blackhawks. And, they did a pretty good job at revamping this team. However, in 2011, the 2011 playoffs, they lost to Vancouver in the first round. Now, you look at it and you see, so they lost in 7, but, they kept it close. Well, they kept it close all right, because Vancouver fans will tell you how stressful of a series that was. Vancouver was up 3-0. They were on the verge of sweeping Chicago. Chicago won 3 in a row. Crazy. And then game 7 went to overtime. And then, who was it? Was it Alex Burrows? Somebody scored in overtime for Vancouver. And Vancouver dodged a big bullet en route to a Stanley Cup Finals appearance. But that was close. Vancouver was an overtime goal away from getting reverse sweeped. And this is a big deal. This is a President's Trophy winning team. Vancouver was an exceptional regular season team during this era. Couldn't get done in the playoffs, though. And that 2011 run was as close as they got. And Chicago was out in the first round. They were out in the first round the next year, too, in 2012. They lost to the Arizona Coyotes. They might have still been the Phoenix Coyotes at that point. I can't quite remember, but I can't remember exactly what year they switched the names. Might be the Houston Coyotes pretty soon. We'll see. Gary Bettman did come out and say in his press conference yesterday they really want to make Arizona work, which is what you kind of expect him to say. So I'm thinking they're going to try to make the Phoenix area work, but we're probably about as close to an Arizona move as we've been in a while, potential move to Houston. But anyways, Arizona went on a little run that year, and it all started with a first-round win against Chicago. So Chicago's sick of getting eliminated in the first round. So 2013 comes around. They won the President's Trophy. They had a fantastic season in that lockout-shortened season. That was only 48 games, I believe. And they went on a run to the Stanley Cup. Yeah, so they beat Minnesota. For the first time, we're going to see them on the screen here. They beat Minnesota in 5 in the first round. They beat Detroit in the second round in 7. Yeah, Detroit was still relevant at this time. I think this was during that time where it was just all about the playoff streak, all about making the playoffs and not actually being good in set playoffs. And then the conference finals, they beat LA in 5. You can see here there was a couple years where it was, they met LA in the conference finals. Those were the two teams in the West, really the serious contenders when it was playoff time. But Chicago got it done against LA in the conference finals, and then they beat Boston in 6 in the Stanley Cup finals. So, and then 2014 comes around. They get all the way to the conference finals. They beat St. Louis in the first round. That is the first and only time they beat St. Louis. And you might have noticed a trend here too. Like, it seems like they were mostly stomping on the Pacific teams early on in their contention. And then, they kind of moved on to their own division and meeting their division a bit more in the playoffs. In fact, those 2 times they lost in the first round, those were both, I think they were both Pacific teams. I know Vancouver definitely was. I can't remember if Arizona was Pacific still. I think they were. But yeah, they start to meet some Central Division teams a bit more regularly here. So St. Louis in the first round, beat them in 6. Minnesota again, second round this time, beat them in 6. And then they lost in the conference finals to LA in 7, which I'm sure was a great series, but I didn't watch it because I hated both of those teams. But, I kind of wish I was a bit more of like kind of an objective hockey fan who could enjoy that series. But unfortunately, I'm plagued with being a Sharks fan, and I probably skipped that. What was, I'm sure, a good series. It went to 7. But I wouldn't know because I hated both those teams. I wish there was a way they could both lose. The LA came out on top, and then they went on to win a Stanley Cup. And I'm pretty sure that might have been the year they reverse sweep the Sharks, the LA Kings, that is. That might have been it. I'm pretty sure that was the year they reversed sweep the Sharks, which is sad. Sharks were up 3-0. LA won 4 in a row. Pretty sure that was 2014. And then 2015, we see the last Stanley Cup from Chicago during this era. And a very impressive run once again. They beat Nashville once again in the first round. It's been a while since they saw Nashville. 6 years. They beat Nashville en route to their first cup, and then they beat Nashville en route to their third cup in 6 games again. And then they swept Minnesota. So 3 years in a row, they beat Minnesota. So when you were looking at fan bases that might be really bitter about the Chicago Blackhawks during this time, Minnesota's got to be up there too. They beat Anaheim in 7. Again, another series I probably didn't watch because I didn't really like the Ducks back then either, because that's part of being a Sharks fan. And then they beat Tampa in the finals, which I think was a really good finals, but I didn't catch a lot of it because I was living in England at the time. And I didn't really want to wake up really early in the morning, like 3 or 4 a.m. just to watch that. I did the next year for San Jose, of course, when I was still living in England. I was getting up, I think, at 3:30 to watch the end of the games before I go to work, which sounds terrible, but, it's your favorite team. You're living overseas. You kind of have to. And that was the third and final cup for Chicago. So a very impressive feat. And again, that's the closest thing we've seen to a dynasty in a while. With so much parity in the NHL, I'm okay with recognizing this as what's called an unofficial dynasty or a modern day dynasty because, I think we will see another dynasty in my lifetime, but I don't know if we see more than one in my lifetime, to be honest. Like, there's so many good teams right now. I mean, just look at it. Like, with expansion and this modern day expansion going so well, I mean, we saw Seattle make the second round in their 2 years of existence, and now we see Vegas already in their second Stanley Cup finals. They might win their first Stanley Cup only 6 years in, and Vegas has been a good team throughout. Even the year they missed the playoffs, they weren't really that bad either. They're mostly just injury plagued, and they didn't miss by much either. Not to mention 4 trips to the conference finals in their 6 years of existence. And those are just the 2 expansion teams. I mean, there's so many good teams now that I think it's safe to say that 3 cups in 6 years, that might be worth recognizing as a modern day dynasty, because it might be a while till we see an official dynasty again. Again, I think we see one in my lifetime. So, hopefully I live to be in my 80s. It'll be in the next 5 decades. I think we'll see another dynasty, but I don't know if we see more than one. So, it's important to recognize this. And I wouldn't be surprised if we never see another dynasty, to be honest. But I kind of feel like we'll see one eventually, right? And I think those 3 cups in 6 years, it kills me to say it as a Sharks fan because I wish we could have won one of those cups. But, this was a very impressive run. This is a well put together team that just gelled. It went beyond just drafting Kane at 1 and then Taves at 2 or 3. I can't remember what he went in his draft. He was a top 3 pick for sure, though. And then you get guys in the later rounds like Keith, and then you bring in guys through trade and signings like Hossa. I think Bufflin was drafted by them too. Niemi, and then eventually Crawford. Crawford was a great goalie in the playoffs for them. In their next 2 Stanley Cups, he was a homegrown talent as well. I think a late pick. He might have been undrafted, actually. So Chicago finding ways to bring in these key guys. Jarmelson as well. That's another guy I didn't even mention, right? Like, there's so many good guys on that team. Oduya, another one. Shaw, Sharp, like, I'm missing guys too. Like, I'm missing some key guys, I'm sure. They had so many guys that were just so clutch in the playoffs. But it did come to an end eventually. So it all started in 2016. I'm pretty sure this was the season that Kane won the Hart after all those kind of sketchy allegations that didn't go anywhere. So it kind of tells me that there wasn't anything there. But I don't know the full story, so who knows. But I think Kane might have been fueled a bit by that, by his kind of reputation that he went on to win the Hart Trophy that year. I think that was the year. And then first round, they met they met St. Louis. St. Louis had a bit of a bone to pick with Chicago, and they beat them in 7. And I think St. Louis went on to the conference finals that year, where they lost to the Sharks, who eventually would lose in the Stanley Cup finals. So, yeah, but en route to that conference final run, St. Louis did beat Chicago in 7. And then the next year, this was the one where I was like, okay, I think this is over for Chicago. Chicago gets swept in the first round by, I think they were the first wild card, actually. I think Chicago won their division, and then they got swept in the first round by Nashville. Nashville getting some revenge, too, for a couple first-round playoff losses to Chicago. And, Nashville getting their revenge. They swept Chicago, and that was pretty much it. So Chicago only made the playoffs once since then, and that was during the COVID playoffs, the first COVID playoffs, 2020. And, I've never been on Team Asterix, as I call it, where people say, oh, the 2020 Cup doesn't count because blah, 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 I want to complain, right? And considering, I've wanted to talk about this on the podcast for a while. I don't want to ramble too much because this is about Chicago. But I think in terms of who ultimately won the Stanley Cup and how the Stanley Cup transpired second round onwards, I don't think it deserves an asterisk at all. I think the right team won the Cup. I think the right team went to the finals. I mean, 2 of the top 4 teams in their respective conferences going in the playoffs made the Stanley Cup finals, that being Tampa and Dallas. I think the right teams made the Cup finals there, including the conference finals too, with having the New York Islanders and Vegas in there too. I think it was that first round where you might be able to put an asterisk on things, though, because you had teams like Chicago. They beat Edmonton in the qualifying round in a 5-game series, and then they lost to Vegas in 5. And I think there, with them and with Montreal, I think you can put a bit of an asterisk on the first round, because it was like, okay, these guys probably weren't making the playoffs if it weren't for this weird COVID setup. And don't get me wrong, I think Bettman did the right thing here. I think that playoff format was as fair as it could get. But I think it's kind of undeniable there might be a bit of an asterisk, at least in terms of those teams that played only a few games because they might have just squeaked into the first round because of the format. But ultimately, the Stanley Cup Finals, the Stanley Cup champion, the Cup went to the right team no matter what. So, in my opinion, really, I feel like Tampa was the right team. It was their time. They won the President's Trophy the season before in a historic season before getting swept by Columbus. Yeah, I think the right team won the Cup that year. But outside of that, Chicago has not made the playoffs. And as of last month, we learned that they will have the first overall pick going into this year's draft following the draft lottery, and they will almost certainly be drafting Connor Bedard first overall. And this is a guy who he might bring Chicago back into the promised land. That he really might be. I mean, when you look at players that have been so hyped over history, there's a pretty good chance there's going to be a Stanley Cup once again out of this. When you look at Lemieux got 2 Stanley Cups for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, Lindros, he was very hyped too, and I don't think he ever won a Stanley Cup. He certainly didn't with Philly, as Philly's never... Oh, no, sorry, they've won the Stanley Cup, but not since the 70s. So, Lindros is pretty hyped, but then you have Crosby, 3 Stanley Cups, and then McDavid. It's honestly surprising that Edmonton hasn't won a cup yet. But at the same time, like I said with Chicago, there's so much parity. I think one of the biggest reasons Edmonton hasn't won a cup yet is, one, because they haven't put a good enough team together. I don't want to deny that. I mean, the best team always wins the Stanley Cup, almost always. Sometimes a team just gets hot like LA did in 2012. But, LA would go on to be a really good team anyways. They won another cup. So I think that 2012 run was more of them finally making that step rather than... randomly having a good run. But anyways, where was I going with that? We see these players like Crosby, McDavid, a lot of them go on to have Stanley Cup success. I know McDavid hasn't hit that point yet, but, provided they can put a good team around Connor Bedard, like they did with Kane. Granted, Kane was kind of at the end of their rebuild. He was kind of the final piece, whereas Bedard is kind of the first piece. So I think Chicago, they're going to have a few more years of, just developing Bedard and getting some higher draft picks and then, making those lower draft picks work. And, they might be back in contention in as soon as, I'm going to say 5 years from now, 4 years maybe. It really depends on what they do. They're going to have some caps. They're going to have some cap space. I know that Seth Jones contract's going to hurt, but who cares? When you're a rebuilding team, does the cap really matter too much? So I think going into this year, I was going to do a segment all about what Chicago could look like next year, but you know what? I don't really know enough about the organization to really kind of do that big of a deep dive, but just kind of on the surface, I think Chicago needs to bring in some vets that, like some wingers that will really help Bedard on potentially that first line for Chicago, right? Look at guys who have been there, done that, and, just bring some good vibes to that organization and really show Bedard how to be a leader, how to be a pro, how to be a successful player in this league. I'm looking at guys like Alex Killorn. Now, it came out Killorn wants to stay in Tampa, and Tampa wants to keep Killorn and make it work. But that type of player, a guy who's won championships like Alex Killorn, bring him into the organization, put him on the wing with Bedard, and really turn Bedard into a pro. And I'm not saying Alex Killorn specifically. I'm saying players like that who have been there, done that, been in the league for a while, won't be too expensive. You don't have to sign them long term. But, kind of like what we saw with Matthews and Patrick Marleau, that kind of deal. Bringing a guy or a few guys to mentor Bedard, show him how to be a pro. So, yeah, it's going to be an exciting time for Chicago. I did want to show Chicago some appreciation, though, really. I know it kills me as a Sharks fan. Vancouver fans are there, too. Minnesota, I can throw Nashville in there, too. Like, it's, it was a tough period for some fan bases seeing teams like Chicago and LA having this success, especially if you're out in the West. I mean, even in the East, too. I mean, it's not like the Eastern Conference teams outside of Boston were winning cups during this time either. And I mean, sandwiched between Pittsburgh as well. It was a tough time for some Eastern Conference fan bases too. But yeah, I feel like I harp too much on the Chicago Blackhawks. I did want to show them a bit of recognition for what they did during this span. Wow, we might actually get to the 1 hour mark on this one. I still got one more thing here. And this segment I'm going to call podcasts I listen to sometimes. I want to talk about some hockey podcasts. Going to have to pick up the pace here too because we are getting up there in time. But hey, it's been a while since I've done a longer podcast, so this is good. But podcasts I listen to sometimes. So during the hockey season, when I'm driving back and forth to the city, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I do. I haven't listened to them too much because I haven't been driving so much. And my taste in podcasts change. And these are the 5 that I usually listen to. Now, first of all, the hockey content creator that I listen to the most is actually on YouTube. It's the Hockey Guy. The Hockey Guy, I plan on talking about him on the podcast, but he is the ultimate hockey channel. He is amazing. The work he puts into his channel is just exceptional. I'll talk about him another time, but if you're looking for a good program for hockey, check out the Hockey Variety Podcast. But also, check out the Hockey Guy on YouTube. He's great. But yeah, I want to talk about 5 hockey podcasts that I listen to sometimes and how my fandom of these podcasts has changed over the years. First, I want to talk about Spit and Chicklets. These guys are probably the biggest hockey podcast out there. They're up there with 32 Thoughts, even though they're both very different podcasts. But with Spit and Chicklets, yeah, it's Paul Bissonnette, RA, a man named Rear Admiral RA, and then Ryan Whitney as well, and then their host Grinelli, he's also on there quite a bit, and then they bring this other guy, I can't remember his name, but I don't really like him too much. And the podcast has changed quite a bit in recent years. It's I can't do that big of a deep dive just because I'm watching the time here, but I don't listen to Spit and Chicklets a whole lot anymore. And you know what it comes down to, really, and I'm not trying to sound pretentious or anything, like if you drink, that's cool. That's your choice. If you gamble, that's fine. It's your choice, right? You're an adult. And if you don't drink or you don't gamble, like I do, again, I'm not trying to sound pretentious. It's just, it's life choice. I feel like Spit and Chicklets is kind of a tough podcast to listen to if you don't drink and you don't gamble. And I know I'm coming from a place of bias too. There's a history of addiction in my family, and I like when I see all this alcohol talk and stuff like that, I'm just like, okay, do these guys have a problem that they're just kind of in denial of? It's kind of like they're promoting kind of a culture with young men of being a party boy, if you will, and I'm at a point in my life now where I'm well past that kind of stuff. Again, I sound super snobby, I know, but it's just like, okay, more alcohol stuff doesn't apply to me. Okay, more gambling stuff doesn't apply to me. And then there's tons of ads in the podcast too. That's one thing I noticed too. It feels like half the podcast is ads, which is kind of a theme with some of the other ones I'm going to talk about too. Don't get me wrong. I understand ads are a part of life now, but it's a lot. And I feel like the good content out of Spit and Chicklets doesn't justify the stuff I don't really care about listening to, like ads, like gambling. I know there was a period of time where they talked about golf a lot too. I don't care about golf. Because I feel like is alienating the right word? Like you're kind of alienating some of your fans that way too. The ones that don't drink, the ones that don't gamble, the ones that don't care about golf. And it makes it a bit tough to listen to, which sucks because I used to love Spit and Chicklets. I thought their interviews are still great, but that's about it for me, And it's just like, I do feel like they're promoting a bit of degeneracy, if you will. I sound like such a snob, I know. But, I remember on a recent episode, like, Ryan Whitney just casually talked about losing $5,000 on a bet. And I'm just like, for you, that might not be a ton of money. But for most of your listeners, including myself, $5,000 is a lot of money. I couldn't imagine losing $5,000 on a bet and then try to explain that to my fiance. I mean, that's a big reason why I don't gamble. It's just like, I don't want to risk myself having a problem, So, and it doesn't even look fun to me. But if I go to Vegas someday, I might like leave my bank card at the hotel, but first take out like $50 and just see where that goes with my $50. That might be it. And even if I come out on top early on and I'm at like $60, I'll be like, hey babe, let's go get some dinner, and then call it a day. I won $10, like that's as far as I could see myself going to gambling. But anyways, I don't listen to Spit and Chicklets too much. 32 Thoughts is another good one. Now, if you're looking for hockey news, just strictly news, Spit and Chicklets is pretty good for news if you're willing to wait it out through the gambling and alcohol and ad talk. But if you're looking for strictly hockey news, 32 Thoughts is definitely the best out there. There are some cringe boomer moments in my opinion. There's some kind of cheesiness that I don't like about Sportsnet as a whole, especially their broadcast. Some of that kind of sprinkles into 32 Thoughts, but overall it's a really good one. And I listen to this one pretty regularly, I would say. I mean, if there's a lot of stuff going on in the NHL, a lot of things where you want to stay up to date with the news, then 32 Thoughts is the way to go. It's quite a good podcast overall. It can be a bit cheesy sometimes. But overall, very good. If you're looking for hockey news, that is the one I recommend the most. If you're looking for good hockey news. The John Scott podcast, this is another one I really like. It's funny. I like the dynamic that John Scott and Tim Wurzburger have. If you don't remember John Scott, he was was a fighter in the NHL for years. He became All-Star MVP one year when he got voted in through the fan vote. I read his book. His book is great. I highly recommend. And his podcast is pretty good too. Again, you get it's weird. You get the boomer moments, but it works, you know. And I really like the talk they have that isn't related to hockey. Like lately, John Scott has been talking a lot about his yard work, and he's got 7 kids. He talks about being a parent, and his co-host is also very good, a very genuine guy. Very relatable for me because I know me and him are about the same age, so he's kind of at the same point in life. It's a very relatable podcast for a guy who's in his early 30s, I find, late 20s too, right? It's a really good podcast. They put out quite a bit of content, 3 podcasts a week, just like 32 Thoughts. 32 Thoughts is about 3 podcasts a week, and yeah, that's a really good one. I recommend it. Again, John Scott, he has his boomer takes, but it works. Not a whole lot of ads either, which is nice. They've had some very good interviews too. I think they had Seth Jarvis on a few weeks ago, or a few months ago now, actually. Because John Scott does have kind of connections in the hockey world still. He could still get pretty good interviews. I think they had Radko Gudas on. They've had bigger names than those guys too. It's a really good podcast, I think. And of the 5 on the screen here, it's probably my favorite. It's a good show. I recommend checking it out. It might not be for everybody, but it is for me. Now, podcasts that I very rarely listen to, for different reasons. Now, I went through a phase where I listened to a ton of podcasts. I think it was one summer, like 2 years ago, and I was just desperate for hockey content, especially during COVID. And one of them was the Ray and Dregs hockey podcast. And this is ran by Ray Ferraro, and I probably should have specified with 32 Thoughts. It's Jeff Merrick and Elliot Friedman. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. But with the Ray and Dregs podcast, Ray Ferraro, Darren Dreger. I've been a fan of Ray Ferraro for years, but lately, now that I listen to his podcast, I realize he's got tons of boomer takes, big time. Dreger is a bit better in that regard, but this podcast, I feel like it doesn't really bring too much together. It's almost like 32 Thoughts, but not as good. It doesn't really move the needle. It has a lot of ads too. That's another thing. Those guys really like talking about Crown Royal. It's annoying. I'm like, you get the alcohol thing there too with them, but not as bad as Spit and Chicklets. But and gambling too, but not quite as bad as Spit and Chicklets, I think. But in that regard, but because I don't think Spit and Chicklets is a bad podcast, I just feel like it doesn't appeal to a lot of people anymore. But the Ray and Dregs podcast, honestly, it's not great. It's probably the worst of the 5 on the screen, I would say. And it doesn't, they don't do anything new, really. It feels like 32 Thoughts, but not as good. I think that's kind of the best way to sum it up. Really, it's just, if you're really desperate for hockey podcasts, I can understand making your way to this one like I did, but yeah, I don't really listen to it anymore. And then the Rink Shrinks. This is an underrated one I want to talk about. So this podcast kind of came into existence because of Spit and Chicklets. Spit and Chicklets had Mike Motto and Brian Yandel, who is the older brother of Keith Yandel. And I think Brian Yandel played a little bit in the NHL. It might have been the A actually, but yeah, Mike Motto, Brian Yandel. These guys talk a lot about like youth hockey culture, especially in the more competitive level. And I know it sounds kind of boring and unappealing to a lot of people, but they do talk about things like crazy parents and reffing. They talk about some topics that don't get covered as well in the other podcasts, because the other four podcasts pretty much it's just NHL, and then every so often some other things. But the Rink Shrinks not quite as NHL focused, though. Granted, they do talk about the NHL sometimes. But they talk about youth hockey. They talk about a lot of problems in youth hockey, a lot of things that are good in youth hockey too. Not too bad on the ads. They got some ads, but not as bad as some of the other ones here. Probably a bit more on par with John Scott's podcast in terms of the ads. And it's two different hockey voices. I think you get a bit of the like higher level like hockey snob vibes a little bit. Like I emailed in a question for them because they do a mailbag segment, and they actually answered my question on the podcast, which I thought was cool. I got a bit of like I'm better than you vibes a little bit, because I asked a question about my beer league, and they're probably like, this guy's talking about beer league, that's like what the heck. Which I get. Maybe I'm putting way too much. Maybe I'm putting my beer league team on way too much of a pedestal, if you will, or whatever. Maybe I think that this is my life, man. Like it's a big deal to me. It might not be a big deal to them, but but there was some of that. But I think that's more of a me problem than a them problem, really. It's a good podcast. It's nice for a long drive. I'll say that. It's about 1 hour to the city from where I live, and it's kind of the perfect podcast for that little road trip, I find. So I highly recommend the Rink Shrinks. I feel like they're a bit more unknown than they should be, because of the 5 podcasts on the screen here, they're probably the most original. They're probably the ones that mix it up the most, and it's different. Really, I think it's a really good podcast. I'd recommend it. Just kind of looking at the ones. I recommend all of the ones except for maybe Range Regs. Range Regs kind of sucks. But if you're interested in the stuff they talk about on Spit Chicklets, check it out. They have good interviews too. It's just at my point in life right now, I'm really not into Spit and Chicklets as much as I used to. If you're looking for hockey news, 32 Thoughts is definitely your way to go. Be prepared for a bit of boomer cringe, but not too bad. It's not too bad. So 32 Thoughts is good for news. If you're looking for just an entertaining podcast, 2 relatable guys, I recommend the John Scott podcast 100%. And if you're looking for one to really mix it up, the Rink Shrinks, big time. Yeah, they're a very good podcast. And yeah, that's it for today's episode. A bit of a throwback to the Hockey Variety Hour podcast days. We went the full hour here, but this is good. I had fun. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast as well. If you are not subscribed on YouTube, I highly recommend you do, so you can get some more podcast action here. Never miss an episode. We are also on Instagram, Hockey Variety Podcast on Instagram. Usually pretty active there. The last few days I've been kind of lacking, but just still follow on Instagram. Hockey Variety Podcast on Facebook. Next episode will be when it is. I'm really busy, but hey, I had a good hour today. This was fun. Hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you next time.